Welcome, everybody. I'm Bruce Shapiro, Executive Director of the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma, based here at Columbia Journalism School. We're a center that brings journalists and clinicians and researchers and scholars together to think about how to tell stories about the most difficult experiences, how to tell stories about violence and conflict and tragedy, and in particular, how to tell stories about aftermath, about aftershock, about what happens when the shooting is over, when the cameras are gone, and people are left to pick up the pieces. That's the work we do at the Dart Center. That's also the subject of Shooting Ghosts, a U.S. Marine, a combat photographer, and their journey back from war, by my friends and colleagues, Thomas J. Brennan and Finbarr O'Reilly. You know, there are a lot of books by war correspondents, by reporters about war. As long as there have been reporters, they've gone to war. You can go back to Thomas Paine and to the 19th century. Reporters go to the front and come back and tell stories of what they see. And there also is a pretty rich literature of soldiers' memoirs, centuries of them. But the literature exploring the relationship between soldiers and journalists, what they experience together, how they look at each other, what their respective homecomings are like, that's a much smaller field. In fact, I was trying to think about it, and very few examples come to mind. You could look at the work of the great Russian short story writer and journalist Isaac Babel, who was, like Finbarr, embedded, in his case, embedded with a unit of Bolshevik soldiers during the war between the Soviet Union and Poland in the first year of the Soviet Union's existence. You could look at Stanley Kubrick's films, which deal, in at least one case, with a soldier and journalist. Right? But other than that, not much comes to mind. And yet, soldiers and journalists spend a lot of time together, which is why we are so lucky that both Thomas and Finbarr have come back alive and well and here and professionally at the top of their game as journalists to talk about it, to talk about what they saw together, what they experienced together, what they experienced separately and together afterward, where they are now. That's the conversation we're going to have tonight. We will probably talk about a lot of things. We'll probably talk about some of the things that they describe in Shooting Ghosts. We will talk about the craft of telling hard stories. We'll talk about trauma and recovery. But I also have to say that this is, forgive me for the long wind-up, but this is sort of a family reunion. We do a fair number of book events here at the Dart Center, but never one like this. I first met Thomas J. Brennan, U.S. Marine Corps retired, through his words in the At War blog of the New York Times, and then in person in, 2011, was it? 2012? 2013. Yeah, when he was recognized in the Dart Awards that we give every year for outstanding journalism on violence and trauma. Finbarr I met first when he was a Nieman Fellow at Harvard, and then as one of our Ochberg Fellows here. Thomas, a couple of years later, was an Ochberg Fellow, and in between those, he also got his Master of Science from the Stabile Investigative Program here. So these are folks who've had a lot to do with the work we do at the Dart Center and whom I've learned much from. So the publication of this book feels almost like a birth. It feels almost like a child coming into the Dart Center family. So with that, before we do anything else, I just want to say mazel tov to you guys. This is a book party as much as it is a panel. The book was just published this week. They've been getting media all over the place. We are lucky to have you guys there, here and there, okay? All over the place. All right. I should also introduce the two of them a little bit before we get to the event itself. And that, again, I find hard because it's almost like introducing members of the family, so I'm going to do the official book bio, which is a little bit more sober and doesn't include embarrassing things I know about each of them.
Good.
Starting with the fact that I wore purple tie to match some of his tattoos. I'm sorry. Anyway, Thomas James Brennan, recipient of the Purple Heart, was a sergeant in the Marine Corps until medically retired in 2012. He served in Iraq during the Battle of Fallujah and was a squad leader in Afghanistan's Helmand Province with the 1st Battalion, 8th Marines. A regular contributor to the New York Times at Warblog, he is the founder of the Warhorse.org, a nonprofit online newsroom dedicated to chronicling the effects of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about the Warhorse later this evening. Finbarr O'Reilly has spent more than a decade working in Africa and the Middle East and has won the World Press Photo of the Year award, the highest individual honor in news photography. He was profiled in the Oscar finalist documentary film Under Fire, Journalists in Combat, and has held fellowships at Harvard, Yale, Columbia, and the MacDowell Colony. He was a Reuters senior photographer for Israel and the Palestinian territories in 2014. In other words, these two writers, their capacity here tonight, bring with them a wealth of experience in war and crisis, in journalism, and in military affairs, pretty much unparalleled. There's a lot of wisdom sitting at this table. The story of Shooting Ghosts, it's not really a war story. It's really a homecoming story. But its mainspring, what turns this into something other than a routine homecoming memoir, if there is such a thing, is an event that Finbarr happened to catch on camera, and that is really sort of where the action of this story begins. Do you want to introduce it, show us your bit of video and your slides, and then we'll take it from there?
Sure, yeah, and maybe we'll, if there's a way to turn the lights down for the video, we'll do that. But basically, I was embedded with TJ's squad in this remote outpost in Helmand Province in 2010, and I'd been there for, I guess, about 10 or 12 days on the occasion when, well, we'll let it run and you'll see what happens.
Cat 2 actual, this is 1 actual. Gunshot wound to right leg. There is an entry and exit wound with a tourniquet on his right leg, right?
Decorez, this is Kunjak. Are you copying the transmissions from the CP?
I looked back and I saw the warhead. It was coming straight towards Chun and I. I told Chun to get down. We both hit the deck. I don't remember the boom. All I remember is after the smoke had cleared, I saw Staff Sergeant Gonzalez running towards us, screaming my name. My name is Thomas Brennan. I'm a sergeant in the United States Marine Corps. I'm with 1st Battalion, 8th Marines, Alpha Company, and I'm the squad leader for 3rd Platoon, 4th Squad. The objective was to push up approximately 4,000 meters to a target building to potentially ambush the Taliban. But we left OP Kunjak at about 1,300. We pushed down into the city in a book. Once we got down there, we probably patrolled in about 400 or 500 meters, and that's when we started taking pretty heavy volumes of fire.
Hey, we're moving! What? They're moving! I'm moving!
We wound up maneuvering on them. We made it about another 75 meters down the road where we hit an open field, and that's where we started taking AK and RPK fire. We set up shop inside a compound. We had the security out there. We had the AMP with the RPK, and I had a saw gunner out there, and I had one of my team leaders out there with the 203 providing suppression. I had Lance Corporal Roche and Lance Corporal Orr moved to the next alleyway to set up our next mounting position, and that's when they got hit with an RPG. We thought they stepped on a pressure plate and got blown up by an IED at first, but then we seen them running back. They were pretty dazed. They suffered grade 2 concussions. We had the corpsman set them inside the compound, take a look at the 2 of them, and that's when myself and Lance Corporal Chun, we ran up to the same alleyway. That's when him and I got knocked out by an RPG that the AMP shot. It hit the telephone pole right next to me. Him and I both suffered 3rd grade concussions. My head really started hurting. I started having trouble seeing. My eyes hurt like hell. I kind of sounded dumber than I used to be because words weren't making sense in my head. But after about 2 days, my eyes started getting back to normal. I could start to focus, trying to piece it all together, but it's all kind of blurry. My squad watched 4 people get hurt. My team leaders still kept doing their job. My junior Marines still kept doing their job. And even the guys that got hurt by the concussions, we were still trying to the best of our ability to do our job. I'm just really proud of my guys, and I can't wait to get back to them and let them know. It's kind of hard to explain. We came together, family sticks together, and as long as I'm good to be out there, I want to be out there with them. We got HESCO barricades as our primary means of defense to keep the enemy out. In our living quarters, we have cami netting over the top. We paid $35 for a giant trash bag to drape over the top of that. That way, you know, since it started to rain a little bit, it'll keep us somewhat dry. But for the most part, it's dusty. It's getting cold. We got the solar showers, but pretty much we rely on baby wipes and clean socks. I showered once at Kunjak in the month I was there, just because the water was too damn cold. Baby wipes get the job done. And we got cots and just whatever our family send us. I miss my wife and daughter. My wife sends me photos of my daughter, and she's just growing up and getting so smart without me being there. It's kind of scary leaving when she's 2 and getting home when she's almost 3, and you miss so much. Being afraid of where you're walking each day, that definitely takes a toll on you. The psychological aspect is tremendous here. Their placement of IEDs, they know exactly where you're going to take cover when they start shooting, so they put them there. So you got to be careful where you run to once you start getting shot at. They've got IEDs on the corners, they've got IEDs in the middle of the roads, and they're only going to strike you with an ambush if it's advantageous to them. You just got to trust your eyes and trust your sweeper up front with the metal detector. One thing I always tell my guys is if today's the day, today's the day. I mean, we do everything we can. There's only so much you can do. The mission can't stop because you're nervous. You got to put one foot in front of the other and just keep going, because if you don't, you'll be standing still, and that makes you an easy target. You could walk up and talk to a local national, and he seems like a straight-up guy, but then 2 days later, you could be detaining him because he was shooting at you. Where they don't wear uniforms, you can't tell the good guys from the bad guys until you catch them doing something guilty. That's got to be the most frustrating thing about it. Before, we couldn't make it 100 meters into the city without getting shot at. Now we can make it 500, 600, 700 meters into the city before we get shot at. So we know we're pushing them back, and I noticed when we went on a patrol that more people were starting to come back. I mean, it's a slow process, you know, every 500 meters we push them back, you know, that allows 100 meters worth of civilians to come back into the city. But if we can get them back to their homes, and then we can really start trying to make a difference by telling them, like, listen, we pushed the Taliban back, you're back in your home, we're keeping you safe, you know, now help us out. The biggest accomplishments to myself are we found the IEDs that they've put out there for us. Nobody's been killed yet from the squad, and we've also killed Taliban. So in my opinion, on the squad level, that's winning the war. Bigger picture is a lot bigger than I am. I know I'm a piece of the puzzle, and you know, if we're not doing our job, then the rest of the puzzle can't fit together. My guys have to trust me, I need to trust my leaders. If I trust them and accomplish the mission they want done, then the bigger picture will fall into place.
Roger, I'm copying 34.35, plain text.
So we'll
Over.
come back in a sec to that RPG, what it did, and the story that flows from it. But maybe let me ask each of you, before that incident, how did you each think about one another's jobs? Thomas, who was this animal, this creature, this journalist who you had embedded with you? How did you think about what he was doing, what your responsibilities to him were? What?
I'm still trying to figure him out.
Yeah.
No, when he first, when I first met Finbarr, and this is pretty much the opening of the book, is I was arriving after a 3-day mission in Afghanistan, and when we showed up to the combat outpost, there was just this really skinny, just gaunt man sitting in the corner, and I thought he worked with KBR or some government contract agency. And then he told me he had cameras with him, and I wanted to shoot him in the foot and throw him over the side of the cliff. It's just an added degree of stress that I'm sure there's a few vets in the room that you don't necessarily get along with the media. You don't necessarily have the best impression of the media, and surely being a squad leader out in the middle of Afghanistan, like I didn't have the best impression of having a journalist around.
Yeah. And how did you think about not only TJ Thomas, but the rest of the crew that you're embedded with? What's your relationship while you're working with them? And how did you think that through?
Well, this was my first time embedding with the Marines. I'd been with the Canadian Army in Kandahar. I'd been with the U.S. Army, also in Kandahar. But this is the first time in Helmand, my first time with the Marines. And when I was with the U.S. Army and told them I was going to the Marines, they said, "Oh, okay, watch out, those guys live hard. They live rough," and they weren't kidding. I mean, you say that outpost, there's not much there. So I knew these were a pretty tough bunch of guys, and a tight-knit, close group of guys who have been fighting and training for months and aren't going to be very open to letting in an outsider to that circle. So I had to find a way to kind of ingratiate myself. One of the tricks that I had for doing that was bringing packs of cigarettes, and so I brought these cartons of cigarettes and tins of chewing tobacco that I handed out in this remote place, which is like gold dust. And yeah, pretty much tried to bribe my way into the circle, and I guess it worked.
Or not.
Yeah. And so, but the other thing is, their big concern, and TJ's concern as the leader of this squad of 15 Marines in this very hostile Taliban stronghold, is that he's got to get all these guys home safely. He's got to look after them. He's responsible for them. That's a huge burden. And to add an unknown element into that, which is what I am as a journalist, I have to be able to convince them that I'm not a liability. I'm not going to get them hurt or injured by doing something stupid, wandering off on patrol and stepping on an IED, or just giving away a position or doing something really dumb. And the only way to do that was to step outside with them and go on these patrols and prove that, I wasn't going to be a problem for them.
So this RPG strike happens. You're concussed. You're blind. Before we move forward from that, there's another journalist to soldier and family interaction that happens that neither one of you knows about at the time. It has to do with how your mom finds out about what happened to you. Talk about that, because it speaks again to the relationship a little bit.
So when I first got medevaced, I got put in the back of an armored vehicle in MRAP and got brought back to OP Kunjak, and Finbarr was on the foot patrol that with my guys still coming back to our fighting position. And when I went back, somebody handed me a satellite phone, and I kept all of my Marines like home phone numbers and my wife's, in case like anybody had to call her on my behalf, in my notebook. So I look up her number, I give her a buzz. And she tells me that what I told her was, I got blown up, I've got my arms and legs, I love you, I'll call you, bye. And I just hung up the phone. And when Finbarr came back, he asked me, in hindsight, asking the concussed guy. Well,
It's the meaning of informed consent, he says to his
However,
ethics
in my
students in the
defense,
audience.
we had the conversation in
Yeah,
advance
yeah,
about,
yeah.
he'd asked me what would I do if something happened on patrol, and I told him I would take the pictures and I would wait, as my agreement with the military was, that I would wait to file the pictures until a family member was informed of a Marine's injury or death. But in this case, before we'd been out of patrol, he'd said, look, if anything happens to me, I want people to know what I've done. I want people to know what my sacrifices are, because folks back home don't know what's happening over here. So he had already given me consent, and on the day, he had phoned home. So for me, that meant that the family had been informed, and he felt more or less the same way, not that he necessarily remembers it.
Yeah, and then so in between the time that I called my wife called my father, and my mom had a Google alert that had been set up for Finbarr's name, because there were pictures that were posting almost daily. So my mom opened up her email at work and saw the picture of me slouched against the wall and had no idea. Like, it wasn't until a coworker read the caption and it said that I had a concussion and then I wasn't dead. That she thought she really just saw a picture of her dead son leaned up against the wall, so she like passed out at work. And I'm sure I'm downplaying it a whole bunch, but
No, but that, I mean, it does speak to the way that with social media and the speed of the internet and the way that we transmit pictures now, you know, in wars past, a canister of film might have been handed to somebody getting on an airplane and wouldn't be published until weeks later. Now it's minutes or hours later after an incident. So the speed with which information is transmitted is greater than ever before. Not quite real time, but almost. But the distance in terms of the experience of what we were going through was so far removed from what they could possibly understand back home. There's this disconnect that really is pretty wrenching.
And one of the many revealing and honest moments in this book involves Thomas's mother's discussion with you about finding this news in that way and how she felt at the time.
Yeah, it's the opening. It's the prologue, I think, to the book where we talk about this, and you know, I feel pretty bad about her having learned about the injury this way, and I'd had a couple of email exchanges with her. But when we finally end up together back in the U.S. and we go to visit your parents, even though I've kind of apologized for the way that happened, I really wanted to make that apology to them in person so that I could really, in a way, be forgiven. And they didn't hold anything against me, which I kind of knew, but I felt obligated to at least say something myself in person.
So this incident happens. You suffer what turns out to be a quite severe traumatic brain injury. PTSD, other issues emerge, which those of us who met you in print in the At War blog, understood in graphic detail, and which you recount in a whole lot of detail here. And it may not be too much of a surprise to think about soldiers going to war and having physical and psychological injury. We'll come back to that, but Finbarr, you've been covering a lot of war by this point, and there's a point after this incident, some other stuff has happened, some other assignments, where it starts to get to you. You have this whole section that begins, I try not to let the grimmer aspects of the job get me down. Like TJ, I've developed a mental checklist of my own, reminders of things to do to keep me grounded. Eventually, it does catch up with you. How did you know? I mean, a wounded soldier, he's got his purple art, he's in the hospital, there's all kinds of ways of knowing that he's being functionally disabled by these injuries. How did you know?
Well, I think I write about it in the book, and it's it's a gradual thing. It's not like there's any one specific moment where I realized it, but there was a sort of gradual kind of emotional numbing where I felt a distance from my girlfriend at the time, and a difficulty to relate to things back home in the way that I could relate to TJ in these conflict zones, or my colleagues when we were out on these stories and the intensity of covering conflict and combat. And there's this strong bond that we develop from being under fire, and it's the same with fellow journalists. And then you come home, and the kind of everyday mundanity of life becomes difficult. Filing expenses, doing your grocery shopping, paying your electricity bill. I was living in West Africa. The internet was always going off, and the car was always breaking down. All these little things sort of become these huge things to deal with, even though they're pretty small. Yeah, I just remember I went out one night and got into a sort of a scuffle with somebody at a bar, and came home, and the guard at the house where I was living in West Africa, in Dakar, he wasn't there to open the door, and I'd had a couple of drinks, and there was this mangy dog that used to hang around outside my house, and I just got out of the car sort of angry for no particular reason. And I remember just sort of kicking this dog in the ribs really hard and violently and sending it sort of yelping down the road away from me. And I got back in the car, and my girlfriend just looked at me like, what the hell is wrong with you? And I kind of realized, okay, yeah, this isn't me. I'm not a violent person. I'm not somebody who does this kind of thing. And the next day she really said, look, you got to get some help. And that's when I finally realized, like the military, photojournalists, we like to be pretty macho guys. We like to think, we're tough, we're strong, we're resilient. But at a certain point, you realize things aren't going that well, and that was the moment for me, and I resisted it for a long time. So I think, one of the things I would encourage people who find themselves maybe denying the effects of, what they may have seen while working, whether it's in a war zone or at home, because lots of stuff is going on in this country now as journalists covering events, is that if you're feeling troubled, talk to your peers, talk to your friends, talk to your family, and seek out the help that you might need, rather than trying to be tough about it.
One of the remarkable things about this book is that it takes us on a meticulously remembered roller coaster ride that both Thomas and Finbarr individually go through. I'm going to read just a little bit of your account, and it's not one of the more graphic moments. There are moments involving inability to physically function in certain ways. There are moments, without doing too many spoiler alerts, but it's been talked about enough, when there's a suicide attempt. There's a lot of very off-the-charts stuff. But here's a moment. On the day of my appointment, this is your first appointment at the Deployment Wellness Center, and as a Marine, and usage point for all journalists here, I used the word soldier generically a few minutes ago. Thomas leans over and whispers in my ear, Marine. This is a non-trivial difference, and it's the kind of thing you want to pay attention to. Students.
He'll never neglect to remind you of that.
I'm going to read just because the book is in front of me. On the day of my appointment, I arrive at 0845 and sit for 30 minutes with other Marines and sailors in the cold waiting room of the mental health center. It's a place where no one makes eye contact or small talk. Nobody wants to be seen sitting here. Just being in this place suggests you're broken. Rumors about damaged gear travels quickly. Eventually, a petite, olive-skinned woman calls my name. She looks Middle Eastern as she escorts me back to her office past a series of key card-secured entryways. I wonder why she would be screening Marines who might be suffering from PTSD after serving in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. Her presence could be a trigger, or maybe this is just a twisted ruse to bring out the worst in a Marine. As soon as I sit down, I begin to sweat. My fingers are trembling when we shake hands. The woman's gilded diplomas stare down at me from the walls. I'm sure she senses my anxiety. She reviews my personal information and deployment history. Then she asks whether I've ever thought of killing myself. Holy shit, I don't even know this woman's name, and that's her first question? I expected that question to be asked, but not like this. I feel violated, and wonder if this is how she treats all patients who've enrolled or been forced into therapy. That recollection of an agonizing moment, and there are a lot of them in this book, really challenging moments. First of all, why did you decide to revisit it? Why did you decide to tell those parts of the story that may be at times exposing, embarrassing, hard for family members to see? There's a lot that's hard in there.
So when I started, I scribble frantically on a whole bunch of notes all the time, and I'm like a hoarder of thoughts because I can't really keep them in my mind long enough anymore, so I just write them down and store them for later. So I found myself sitting at home or sitting in these waiting rooms taking notes and writing and just trying to get things down on paper so I could process them later instead of torturing myself wondering like what had happened and what I'm forgetting and what I need to remember. And the common theme between the suicide attempt, me enrolling in help, the issues that my wife and I faced, and stuff that happened between my mother and I, like loneliness was the common theme, and I felt very alone going to those appointments. I felt very alone coming home from those appointments. I even felt alone laying in bed with my wife. So I mean, it was. I wanted to revisit it all because, like, everybody gets alone every once in a while, and like, what are you gonna do when you have one more bad day and can't take it anymore. So if it like helps one person who understands the loneliness, then like that's why it was worth it to me to visit it. And also, I mean, writing at the end of the day and sitting down and writing the book, it was therapeutic for me. It allowed me. I got hundreds of letters that my wife and I exchanged throughout my deployments, and you know, she kept hers, I kept mine, and I had to go through and read all of those, and it was almost like my own form of exposure therapy. And I got to look at. I had to I had to interview her about it. I had to talk to Finn about different things, my Marines and my squad. So I treated it like a reporting assignment, and it allowed me to arrange all those thoughts that had been collected on paper, and like organize them into a book, and hope, I don't know, I just hope it helps people.
You told me a story the other day about someone who read in the at-war version the story of your suicide attempt. Do you want to tell that story? Because I think it's important.
Yeah, so I was, before I came up here, one of my first journalism jobs when I got to the Marine Corps was at the Daily News in Jacksonville, North Carolina. And while I had written for the Times before that, and then I was doing daily beat reporting on the military, but I'd still write occasionally for the New York Times. And it took me, I think, a little over a year to write the story about my suicide attempt, and then like to actually be in a place where I felt comfortable sharing that on such a very public platform. But I think it had been like a week or so after the story had ran, and my desk line rings at the Daily News, and it's a Marine veteran who tells me that he had searched online for like clean, painless ways to kill himself, and that the search engine optimization on the New York Times story, the suicide attempt story, that made it one of the, because like the news shows up first on the Google search, like it showed up like that, and like he read it and he just wanted to call me and tell me like that's the reason why he didn't kill himself. So I mean that was just awesome. Like there's really no other way to put it, but it like knowing that you've made an impact on a truly micro level, like it goes back to like reaching someone in their loneliest moment, because coming back from war, like it sucks, like dealing with depression and mental health and brain injury. Like I'm sure everybody in this room here has had a day where they didn't want to get out of bed. Like what happens when you've laid in bed for too many days. Like, so.
And Bruce, I think also the point as well is that we're in these two professions, me as a photographer, or a conflict photographer, TJ as a Marine, where you're supposed to show this brave front on everything. And I think to punch through that kind of myth and that stereotype, we have to reveal in the book our weaker moments, the moments we're not proud of, and the things we may even be ashamed of or embarrassed of. And without those things, I think the book doesn't have the kind of value that we wanted it to have. We really have to kind of expose everything.
You talk about your own isolation and loneliness, even after you go to get help, and you talk about your encounters with a psychiatrist and the battling the voice within you describe. You also talk about the extreme isolation you feel from, London's boozy journalist culture, you say at one point. What began to get you out of that isolation? How did you begin to address it?
Well, I think this is one of the things about trauma, is that it is isolating, and the instinct when you're feeling bruised in any kind of way or wounded is to withdraw. I mean, that's an evolutionary development. We want to withdraw to safety, and that safety is often within ourselves, and we kind of retreat to the shadows, away from anything that might damage us further. That's just how we're evolutionarily programmed. But that's the exact moment when we're most vulnerable, and we need to actually be engaging with people around us. And for me, that ended up being working with TJ, and that's what comes out in the book. So yes, I was the one who was mentoring him into journalism, as he wanted to write about his experiences, encouraged him and connected him with the New York Times for him to do that series that went on to win the honorable mention with the Dart Awards. But I was feeling very much at a loss journalistically, that my work wasn't having the impact that I hoped it would have on the stories that I was covering, mostly in Central and West Africa, and feeling very disillusioned and disheartened about being unable to change anything. but there was seeing very tangible results from helping this one individual, and that was transformative for me in a way.
But it's a big leap from that, a big leap from even having gone through this particular series of events together, and a big leap from talking about what a journalism career might look like or whatever, to deciding to tell this intertwined story. I mean, it's hard enough to tell your own story. I mean, my few forays into first-person writing have been exercises in control mania. What made you decide to kind of take this on as a joint story?
Well, while I was on this fellowship studying the psychology of trauma on my Neiman year at Harvard, I got really excited about soaking up all the information that I could about trauma and neuroscience, and I thought, wow, I want to write about this stuff, and I can use our story to get into it, and started thinking that would be the way to do something really interesting. But as I started working on this idea, I realized that actually people don't really want to read a bunch of neuroscience from a layperson. What they want is an interesting story with interesting characters, and I guess I thought we had something to contribute in a way, and also we both needed to process our experiences, and through talking with one another and seeing the way that TJ was writing about his experiences. I'm a journalist. I was a Newswire journalist, and our profession is meant to be objective and have this distance and not write in the first person and not become the story. So I was pretty reluctant initially to put myself out there in the same way that he was doing. But seeing the way that it was having a positive impact on himself and also on the people he was writing for, I thought, okay, well, maybe I should give this a go as well. And it was hard for me. The first drafts were very kind of superficial and didn't dive quite as deep as we do now in the book.
And you still have a little bit, your voice in the book is a little more distanced,
Yep.
even though it's first person, it's
Yep.
a little cooler,
Yeah.
tends to be, right? Yours is much more direct, raw.
He's the Marine. He's got to be blunt.
Well, you're a Marine, but you also have, and I think this is very important for those of us who are who reporters thinking about writing about personal experiences, you also have that associative, that very direct access to detail and memory. You kind of let it pour out of you. And I think that's, you're observing yourself a little more, and you're just kind of there. I think that's, you can tell at any given moment, you can open the book up and know which of these characters, who we now know as characters, Finbarr and Thomas, are speaking, just from that. But okay, so you both kind of think you want to do this. Now there's a craft part about telling a true trauma story. I mean, I'm talking as if you both are putting it all out there and it's all just sort of vomited forth, but it's not. You have to decide how much detail to put in and not, who to name by name and who not, how much of yourself to expose and not, and to decide not only for yourself, but in collaboration with someone in this case. What was that process? What were your standards? This is a story about war and a story about psychological breakdown and a story about resilience in which many difficult things happen and in which hopeful things happen. How did you decide, draft after draft after draft, what goes in and what doesn't, what's news and what isn't?
It felt pretty organic, really. I mean, it's a chronological story, except for the first chapter or the prologue, which really dumps us into the middle of the narrative, and then we backtrack to pretty much where we first meet. So it was a question of writing out what had happened and having a look at where there was overlap. And we originally started writing the book and sold the book proposal to the publisher with me writing about TJ in the third person. I was the journalist, and he was, in a way, my subject. Even though he was writing his chapters, we wrote them in the third person, and I would do some interpretation and the journalistic thing. And when we were after our meeting and the publishers bought the book, they said, why don't you try it in the dual first-person narrative? And that's when TJ's voice really came through and created this tension that runs through the book. and adds a great deal to it. His voice really, and by that time as well, he was here at Columbia. The craft of his writing was getting so much better through his time writing for the New York Times and
Thank you,
working
Sheila.
here. Yeah, Sheila, you can take the credit on that one.
Sheila Carnell, the Dean of Academic Affairs and head of the Stabile program. Yes.
And so it was pretty organic, and things started to make sense. And we would just send the chapters back and forth to one another and determine who was going to say what part at when, and see, sort of try and get a sense of what felt natural in terms of the handoff. And everything, there were a few little structural tweaks as we went through various revisions and cutting out some of the sort of excessive detail or overly florid language that maybe I was a little more inclined to. But yeah, so I mean, it was just organic, really.
Was it so organic for you?
So Finbarr was living all over Africa and Israel, and he was in Gaza, and it was in this he was everywhere during the course of writing the book. So it was like he would send me a draft of his chapter, and I would go through it, make suggestions, and then I could add little bits of detail that I knew from my own perspective in there, and he would do the same for me, and it was just a massage back and forth, and then moving this piece this portion from this place to another. Things went surprisingly smooth.
Yeah,
When you think of you'd think there would be a lot of tension, but really it was just we both had the end goal of writing a compelling narrative that was honest. I mean, we figured put a true vomit draft, put all of your emotions down, put all of your detail down, and then just pare it back and really try to get the concise narrative you're looking for.
And we had plenty of vivid scenes, and so we would tend to write those first and then try to work on the transitions on how to connect them. So if you've got like these big chunks of the body, and then it's like adding the connective tissue between them.
Yeah. You also got to know each other in a different way, as people do when you collaborate on a piece of writing, right? You get to know one another in a different way. Trust works in a different way. You view one another in a different way. And there's a point in the book.
I think I know where this is. But
In August of 2013.
Yep.
And I'm not going to do a spoiler on what the story is, but you decided, after years of knowing this guy, to tell him a story he had not heard before, a story about your involvement in the death of someone in Fallujah, and it's a hard story. It's one of the hard stories in the book. And first of all, what made you decide at that point to trust Finbarr enough? And this is kind of, in a way, now as a reporter, I'm wondering, what were the conditions that enabled this very important story, which is another hinge in the book, to come out?
He was patient and not pushy. I think that was the biggest thing. He took the time to earn my trust. I'd had other interactions, and I still continue to have some interactions with people in our profession that don't take their time, and you feel 100% like a source, and it makes you walk away feeling used and violated. I mean, having the first question be asked of you, like, please tell me about the worst day of your life. It's whether it's surviving war, or if it's rape or genocide or whatever it is. I mean, walking up and asking somebody about the absolute most terrible instance in their life is not cool. And this is the TBI moment, because I forgot your question.
Well, just what enabled you to trust Finbarr enough, and why wait, and maybe even why wait that long? Because it's both sides. Why did this one sit, and then why did it come out?
It was it's my most traumatic moment. We were sitting at the front porch of my house. I'd known Finbarr for years at that point, and I stared into another human's eyes as he died, and watching the flicker of life leave another human from that close, like, that sticks around with you. And like Finn was my friend at that point. He wasn't just a cool journalist that I'd hung out with. He wasn't just this guy that I occasionally talked to, and like we were friends and I trusted him. But it wasn't a story that I trusted a lot of people with, and I told them about it, and it wasn't like a holy shit, you're an evil person. Sorry for the language. But he was accepting. He actually listened to my experience, and like he wasn't immediately judgmental. Because I think he knew the vulnerability that I had to show to be able to be willing to share such an intimate story like that. And then like that scene in the book was something that we discussed all the way up days before like final manuscript was due,
Yeah.
because it's just such a painful moment in my life. But it goes back to like we put the vomit draft down and we made sure that we had everything there, because if we held back on the honesty in anything that we were talking about in the book, we believed that would have shown through, and people would have saw that there was something missing, or that we weren't being as honest as we could have been.
But Finbarr, then you go on in the book to say that hearing that story made you understand trauma differently. Thomas's in particular, but in general. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think up until that point, I thought that what was troubling TJ was the fact that he'd almost been killed in Helmand when I was with him. And I realized, no, this runs much deeper. This is the moral weight of having killed in combat and the guilt associated with that. These were things that he was grappling with on a far deeper level than the guilt of having some of his Marines wounded in Afghanistan. And it speaks to the depth of trauma that it took him almost 3 years for him to tell me this story, and then for us to decide how important it was to include in the book. And then we decided that we have to come forward and be very forthcoming with this, and how many layers there are to different kinds of trauma and how to process those experiences.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me also that you went through this together. Somewhere in the book you quote our mutual friend Jonathan Shea, who's a psychiatrist, saying that nobody deals with this alone. And you were one another's supports. You each also have other supports, which you chronicle in the book, your families, your medical providers, your others. You come out of it, and the story also moves on to where you are now, or at least where you were when things end. And we should go there for a few minutes. I mean, you ended up coming to this school a couple of years ago, and, students come to this school. How many current MS students are here? Good, lots of you. A lot of you come here with a plan, saying, I'm coming to school to do X, Y, and Z. This guy walks in, he sits down in my office and says, what I'm really planning to do is start a nonprofit investigative news organization to do reporting on military and veterans issues. And I listen politely and I say, yes, but go do your reporting assignments and go to your essentials classes, and we'll see where you are at the end of the year. Talk about the Warhorse, please, and what you're doing now.
By the way, this is how our whole collaboration started as well. The first time he wrote, he's like, I want to write about blog about military affairs and so on and so on. This is before he'd written anything for publication. And I just thought, good luck with that.
Yeah.
Go.
So, introduce us to the Warhorse, please. Conflict of interest alerts, and some of my ethics students are here. I'm on the advisory board to this thing, but go.
So the Warhorse is the only nonprofit newsroom. Here's the communications. What I'm supposed to say about the Warhorse.
Just pull the string.
Pull the string and I'll go. We're the only nonprofit newsroom focused on the Department of Defense and the Department of Veterans Affairs. And I mean, we started out as, for some reason, I wanted to call us War and Peace at first. Like I thought that would be a good idea, which justifies why Bruce thought I was initially crazy. Like the Middle Ground Project, and it first started out me wanting to do like killed in action profiles, because I was really, really angry at the fact that you get these casualty announcements that are 30 words or 200 words, and it's it's wrong. So I wanted to do something like that, and then coming here, I had various professors that were, no, you need to think about diversifying it. You can't look as though you're just like strictly pro-troops. So that's where we get, we do the good, the bad, and the ugly. We investigations, features, and we hosted our first writing seminar here that Bruce was a guest speaker at.
And those of you who follow military affairs nationally would also know that the Warhorse got national headlines just a few months ago for exposing the Marines United scandal involving online photo sharing and harassment of women in the Marine Corps, which involved threats and other harassment to you, and now in a way putting on your where your journalistic and military and trauma hats all come into place. It must have been challenging for you. In fact, I know it was challenging for you, but maybe talk about it, to deal with anger coming at you from the Marine Corps and threats coming at you from some Marines and support coming at you from Marines. Talk about why you did the story and also what it was like a little bit.
So at first I was too scared to tell the story. I initially told the Marine Corps about it as an anonymous tip, and then when they told me that they didn't in fact do anything and they just had it deleted, that's when I said, now put my reporter hat on, let's roll. So when halfway through my investigation, I went up to the Pentagon and walked into a room, I think with like 15 or 17 people in it. And they were all high-ranking military officials, public affairs, and I basically presented them all the evidence that I had for my story and said, this is what my reporting will show, this is my evidence behind it, and all right, it's time to comment. But in that room, I said, none of this is on the record. I want every single one of you to understand what I found, because you guys are going to own this, because it's real, and I'm going to prove it to you. And I did. And then, so we were supposed to initially publish on a Wednesday, and the Friday before that, they published a public affairs guidance, which was basically their summary of what they thought my reporting was, and their political, or their public affairs response, like how they were going to answer it to the media, and then we published Saturday afternoon because we didn't like that, and within 4 hours of me publishing, I was sitting in my driveway, with my laptop, my wife's laptop, spread out across the sheriff deputy's car, like showing them, like, all right, putting investigative journalism to work. Thank you again, Sheila, for teaching me public records for finding people. It's like like I was able to find out who these people were that were sending rape and death threats and placing bounties on images of my wife and daughter. And all these same people. Like my most recent email was today on how I'm a disgrace to the Marine Corps and I don't understand what Semper Fidelis means, and the responses were varied, but at a point, like the Warhorse we still don't have a ton of money right now. We're still a struggling startup, but at the same time, we have a lot more money now than we did, and back then it was just incredibly intense because I was like a prisoner in my own home. And my advice for journalists that deal with online doxing or threats against their families or online harassment for stories like this is put your damn phone down. Put your damn phone down. Like,
why didn't you listen to me when I told you that?
It's honestly one of those things. Like, I really hope that any journalists that watch this 10 years from now, really, you're not going to understand it until you get in that situation, and you need to put your phone down. You feel very helpless and out of control, like you're at the disposal of the internet, which can be a very disgusting and ugly place. But in hindsight, I look at the reporting that myself and the Warhorse published. Our hypothesis that there was pandemic sexual exploitation within the Department of Defense, and by my family and I receiving rape and death threats, I think they proved my hypothesis. So
And I think it should be said, you at this point, knew yourself very well, and I think you won't mind me saying to them that for someone who has been, whether it is as a Marine or in civilian life or as a torture victim, for someone who has been attacked and threatened earlier in their life, to then as a journalist have these threats coming at your family is a very challenging thing. So if I had a hat on, it would be off to you at this moment for continuing to do it. Finbarr, you have continued to do some very cool stuff. Have you been thinking about your work, and what kind of work have you been doing?
Are you talking about all the cycling I've been doing or something?
Well, among other things, teaching, cycling, all that.
Yeah.
I mean, seriously, you're at this point where you've finished this book project. You also have been thinking about trauma and your relationship to it as storyteller as well as survivor for a long time. What have you been up to? Where are you at with it?
Well, really, the focus of my efforts for the last 2 years are very much, 4 years of working on the book, but the last 2 completely focused on it. That has been hugely helpful and healthy for me to gain the distance and perspective from the events we write about in the book and to put them into a sort of broader global context in a way. And that's allowed me to sort of reach a point where I feel like I could pick up a camera again and shoot pictures, because I haven't really done that for the last 2 years. And I've been talking with people about that kind of work, but also doing some teaching and mentoring. And certainly my experience with TJ has been one where I get a great amount of satisfaction from working one-to-one or with people who are beginning in the profession and seeing them flourish and seeing them doing interesting things. And there are a few other opportunities that are sort of sliding my way as a result of what we've done with the book. So I'm looking into all of those things, and I think it'll end up being a mixture of teaching, writing, and photography as I move forward.
Some of the most gorgeous photographs of cycling anywhere have been taken by this guy on his long solo rides in the Catskills and in the Wicklow Mountains. I will just tell you all that. Find him on Instagram. Let's do some questions from the floor. Do we have a mic set up somewhere? Where is it? Kelly, can you do the honors and bring it over here first? While the microphone is making its way around the room, I would say remember that this is being videoed and will be streamed eventually on the Dart Center website, so don't say anything that would embarrass you, your children, or Finbarr's mom, who's sitting here.
Hey, Mom.
And keep your question focused and tight to allow time for conversation and time for other questions, which is also my nice way of saying that if you ramble, I'll cut you off. Okay.
Hello, my name's Sarah Samora. I'm a Marine vet as well, I'm an MS student, so my question's for you, TJ. You being a Marine vet and also going for PTSD and TBI and coming over here, how did you handle it? How were you able to manage it, as well as being able to participate in such an intense program?
I find that if I keep my mind busy, I'm actually much better off than if I leave myself sitting still. So the constant pressure of making sure I was always busy with an assignment or a story has been, it allows me to keep, when your mind's idle, it goes to places that you don't want it to. And that's really how I do it. And that's, I send one draft to, I would send one draft to Finn, and 30 minutes later I'd realize that I messed up one word. I wanted to change it, and like, no, use this draft. No, use this draft. No, use this draft. So like I'm.
I mean, in terms of your time here, which was also part of the question, work. 2 other things, if I can add, come to mind. One is that I thought you were very smart from the time you walked in the door about cultivating close relationships with mentors on the faculty, figuring out who a few people were who got you and whom you could talk to through the year. I think that made a difference.
Yeah, and I also, my roommate was also, he's a Navy veteran. I mean, so
Yeah.
he hadn't seen combat or anything, but it was still like somebody that had worn the uniform just like I had. We didn't see eye to eye on a lot of things, but at the same time, it was somebody who understood what it at least meant to serve. So I felt a whole lot less alone. And then I mean, Columbia has one of the most robust veteran communities, especially in the Ivy League. So that definitely helped.
And-
But
and
again,
I-
it was just keep myself busy.
And I think there was a supporting role for played by Mr. Luke. Is that right?
Yeah. So I really, when I first got out, I was just grabbing at anything to try and make myself feel better. I knew that sitting on my couch at the house wasn't the best thing for me. Again, like keeping myself busy, and avoidance is the key thing. Like, again, you lock yourself in and you feel lonely. And I wound up, Semper Fi Fund, which is it's a non-veteran nonprofit, wound up paying for one of my dogs to be trained as a service animal, and we worked together for about 2 years. So Mr. Luke helped me really get out there. And then obviously journalism, you're forced to talk to people. So when I started writing, my social worker Frank and my psychiatrist Dr. Webster, I mean, like, I love them to death. Like they kept pushing me. It was something that I latched onto. Like, it forced me to talk to people. It forced me to get out of the house, and I was really able to. I still have my bad days. Like, I want to make that clear. I have my bad weeks and months, but again, like keeping. Yeah, I lost my train of thought.
No, you got it.
Yeah.
That was it. Thank you. Someone else? Come on, room full of journalists.
Hi. I have 2 questions. So, since it's a recent publication, I don't know how often you've been in front of people and watched the video, but how do both of you feel listening to the sounds and watching the video in front of all of us, reliving it? And the second question is directed more to TJ, but both of you can answer. But you talked about one experience that was the most challenging for you, and it took you 3 years to talk to Finbarr about it. Now you talk about it seemingly a lot easier in front of a group of people. So the experience of writing a memoir in discussing something that was so traumatic for you, and I'm sure, I haven't read the book yet, but I'm sure you have an equivalent for yourself. So how writing it has changed the experience of talking about something that's initially more difficult.
Finn, you want to take that first?
Sure. I mean, I think it applies to also seeing this as well as any of the experiences that we discussed, including the one that you're referring to, is that writing the book has allowed us time to process these experiences and to kind of make sense of them and position them in a way that they may feel less traumatic because they're in a context. So one of the things that, Bruce, you asked, and I meant to mention it when you said, why did TJ feel able to, that's a nice song.
Sorry about that. It's mine. I'm the one who's always telling people to turn off their phones, and it just suddenly started. Sorry about that.
So I think one of the reasons why TJ felt comfortable after 3 years to tell me this particular story that we're referring to is that he had been speaking with other veterans. He'd started writing a series for his newspaper about veterans of World War II and Korea and Vietnam. And he had learned that many of these veterans themselves had been through similar experiences and done things in combat that they weren't proud of. And he had been able to put it into a kind of historical context. And I think in a way, by writing the book, we've put our own experiences into a historical context so that we have that not quite clinical distance from it, but it feels less raw and less emotional. I don't feel any triggers with this when I watch it now, although for the, if I haven't watched it for a long time and I'm sitting at home and I put the headphones on, I know my adrenaline spikes a little bit at the sound of the gunfire. But that's actually kind of a nice thing because I miss it a little bit. I don't know about for you, when you see that stuff, when you hear it. I mean, you were the one who was injured that day. I was just taking pictures. How is it for you?
Yeah, the first thing that stands out to me about that video is I don't think I have a Boston accent right now, and I really didn't have much of a Boston accent when I was in the Marine Corps, but that was 2 weeks after the explosion, and now I had the other night when we did the book launch party at
Half King.
Half King.
Yeah.
Yeah, like we played this for the first time, and I was like, oh my God, I have a Boston accent. Like, where did that come from? So, like, that's what I hear when I see that. It's like, why did I get my Boston accent back for a period of time? And then for the second part, it really is like the distance from it, and it's.
But also confronting it.
Yeah, like I had to confront it, and I was forced to talk about these things with my Marines, with my mental health team, with my family, with all the people that went into reporting this.
And also writing about it. I remember when
writing it.
When we were writing it, there was a lot of back and forth, and I would push you, but I would push you gently to, go a little deeper on this, go a little further, tell us a little bit more about some of the things that were happening in combat. And I remember they were difficult days for you to write those, but I think ultimately now you can come back and look at them with a different perspective.
Well, that, and I had a recent op-ed for the New York Times where I talk about how medical cannabis for veterans is something that I fully support, and I wrote a good chunk of the book having been medicated. So I mean, like, that helps you. That helps you. Thank you. That helps you. It helps. Yeah. It helps.
And for the record, Thomas's op-ed in the New York Times the other day on this subject is very eloquent, evidence-based, and spot-on science.
Yeah.
Meg Kisser.
Hi, thank you so much. So this might be a variation on the two questions that were previously asked, but can you talk about the process? How do you stare in the face of these most difficult moments of your life and not just collapse into a pile? So just the very granular process, like, did you decide to write early in the morning and then go for a bike ride, or then smoke a blunt, or do whatever you were going to do? What was your process?
So he smokes, I ride.
As you can see, somebody eats a few more munchies than the other person.
I think, these experiences aren't always great ones, but in a way I don't think we would give them up for what we've gained from having been through them. And once you've gained that experience, you want to be able to share, in some sense, what you've learned from them, to give them a greater sense of meaning. Otherwise, they're just lost and become nothing but your own. And if we can share a little bit not only what happened, but what it means and what we've learned from it, then I think those negative experiences take on a different form and a different shape. The other part of that question is I like to work late at night, and my most productive time of day is sort of from 9 p.m. till 2 a.m. That's my quiet, everything's dark. So I tend to exercise, and I'll go for a bike ride for 10, 12 hours a day sometimes. And
Insane.
And this is a Marine talking here. I mean, okay.
And that allowed me to think a lot. It was part of my, creative process. And as a friend of ours, Santiago, would say, the mind circles the wheel. And I would do some of my research with audiobooks. I'd put on memoirs that I was interested in reading, or stories about war that I was interested in reading. But, I'd listen to them while I rode and make mental notes about how, what writing techniques worked and what things I found useful. And in that sense, you could absorb a lot over time, and it was, even I may have just sometimes, the weird thing about writing is you're kind of always doing it, even when you're just lying on the couch staring at the ceiling. That's still writing in a way. It's hard to convince your friends that you're working, but or your mom.
Or family.
Yeah. But yeah, no, I was working real hard.
And what was your structure? While you were working on this? For you.
I was also a night owl because my wife at the time was working night shift at the ER, so she would be getting ready at 4:30 in the afternoon. Like, I would just start getting the wheels turning inside my head, and then as soon as our daughter went to bed, it was really like I'd just hop in the truck, roll up the windows, and start ticking away on the keyboard. So, I was a night owl. I had to, and I still do my best writing at night as well, like in the evening. I like sitting out at dusk and kind of listening to the crickets come in, and I live in the middle of nowhere, so.
Yeah. Okay, one more question, and then we'll call it an evening, I think.
So sorry if this question seems naive, but do you think after experiencing the trauma that you have reporting and I think it's just in conflict in general, you would go back, should go back, or want to go back covering conflict?
That's a good question. That's a fair question. Thank you. When you've been in these places and done this kind of work, there are certain things that definitely appeal. I know for TJ, the thing he misses is not necessarily the thrill of being in combat, but being around the fire pit at OP Kunjak with his boys. And for me, I miss the camaraderie of being out with my fellow journalists sometimes, even though I worked alone a lot. It is pretty great when you get out in these places and you experience, really sitting on the edge of history and documenting it. And there's a thrill to that. So I miss those kinds of things. But I think I've made a decision now that I don't want to do this kind of work. And if I do go back to covering conflict in any way, it would very much be on the periphery, looking at things that don't involve that kind of stuff. So yeah, we miss it to some degree, but you know, I feel like I've had my run at that, and there are others who are younger and better at it than I am, so it's their turn now.
And you have stayed in the military zone, but not covering conflict. Talk about that.
Correct. So the one, really why I got medically retired was because when they did a QE, the bunch of crap all over your head that reads your brainwaves, they found like an underactive portion on like this side of my head here, which is where the blast waves came in. So it's not safe for me to be near explosions anymore. I mean, for me,
You might get your Boston accent back again.
maybe. For me, it's like again, I want to go back to the fire pit with my guys. Like my family and their families used to send us ramen noodles, pasta, like cans of pasta sauce and stuff like that. Like we were in the middle of nowhere. Our command couldn't see us having a fire at night. We'd sit around and I'd be TJ, you know, the Roche would be Jim. Like we'd actually like just be Marines. And it for me, there's a thrill to being shot at. Anybody in this room that's been shot at knows exactly what the hell I'm talking about. But Bruce said something to me before the DART award that is, and I'm probably gonna butcher how he said it, but like that the real stories, it's always meant a lot to me. Like the real stories matter when the trucks pull away and when the cameras go away and then when the reporters don't care anymore about the breaking news. Like that's when the real stories start coming out. And the more I pay attention to what goes on in the veteran community and how there's just a pure lack of voice and responsible journalism for the experiences we've had and the impact that war will have on us for the rest of our lives, like that's, I don't know, like that's my second calling. That's my public service now. Like, and it's also my way of, like with Marines United, like the Marine Corps is better than that. Like the Marine Corps is a whole lot better than that. And journalism allows me to, you know, to sound cliche, to keep our honor clean. So it allows me to continue the service that I was pulled away from involuntarily when I got blown up.
Well, I can't think of a better place to end on. Thank you for that. Thank you both for this, for your honesty and clarity, and for this beautiful book.